Hi, this is Tyler Danzel, Educational Finance, Module 16 Case Study, the Missing Booster Club Funds. A summary of our problem. There was some money that went missing from the ticket sales box during the most recent school basketball game at George Washington Middle School. The school principal, during his regular accounting of the money after the game, discovered that there was money missing. And early evidence points to one of the parent volunteers possibly being responsible. There's a couple of reasons for this. She is the one who assisted with ticket sales and the accounting of the ticket sales. She had also, the week before, met with the principal, Mr. Stevens, to request funds for a cheer trip her daughter was going on, and that request was denied. So what do we already know? Number one, George Washington Middle School is a neighborhood school of 450 students. Despite the size of the school, Mr. Daniel Stevens is the only administrator in the building. Because of this, the school asks for lots of parent volunteers to help conduct their events. One parent volunteer, Mrs. Alice Bowman, has a daughter who's a 7th grader and a member of the cheer squad. She also had 2 children previously go through George Washington Middle School. Her daughter, Lucy Bowman, was recently selected to participate in a all-star cheer competition and parade in New York. And Mrs. Bowman had met with Mr. Stevens to ask the PTA to help fund the trip. She was asking for nearly $800, and Mr. Stevens denied this request. We also know that funds went missing at the next school basketball game, and Mrs. Bowman had been assisting with ticket sales and also the accounting of ticket sales. She noted that there were 10 tickets that were torn and unusable. One patron, Mr. Dumas, who had visited with Mr. Stevens during the game, said he had paid with a $50 bill. He had just gotten paid from his job and had a $50. And the reason that is interesting is because there was no $50 bill present when Mr. Stevens was accounting for the funds after the game. What do we need to know? First of all, I'd like to know who assisted Mrs. Bowman. There was another parent volunteer that assisted with ticket sales. I'd like to know who that person was. And either this other parent volunteer or Mrs. Bowman would be able to tell us if in fact Mr. Dumas did pay with a $50 bill. And if so, did any patrons pay with a $100 bill that would require them to give the 50 as change? And can both ticket takers confirm that there were torn tickets? Identifying the problem. So obviously ticket sales funds are missing and we don't know who is responsible. I'd like to know how those tickets were torn. Were they already torn when the cash box was received, or did it happen during the evening? And I'd also like to know where Mr. Dumas' $50 bill is. So our plan of action, step 1. If this were a smaller school district, I would want to visit with my superintendent to make them aware. But I don't know that it is a small district, so if we can't visit with the superintendent, then I would have my bookkeeper double check my findings and double check my accounting of the ticket sales box. I would want to find out who assisted Mrs. Bowman so I could visit with them. I would let Mrs. Bowman know about the issue to see if she had any insight into the problem. And then I would contact the person who assisted Mrs. Bowman. And I would definitely, after that, look at our procedures, the way we account for gate proceeds, and the way the procedure during the evening. So, number 1, I think the principal needs to check in more frequently with workers just to make sure everything is going okay. And then I don't think the parent volunteers should be the ones doing the accounting of the ticket sales. The principal should probably assist with that. Resolving the issue, number 1, again, I would look at our proceeds for the collection and accounting of the gate proceeds. Again, I've already mentioned this, but the principal should check in more frequently with workers during the event, and he should assist with the accounting. If at all possible, I think Mr. Stevens needs some additional help at the school, not just during events, but also during the regular school day, whether this is an assistant principal or a athletic director. I would encourage the PTA to create a policy on whether or not they will assist individual students with things such as this cheer trip. I certainly don't think that they should be footing the whole bill, but I think it might be appropriate to contribute up to a certain dollar amount. Something else that our authors mention is that when it comes to PTA organizations, the principal technically should just be an advisor and should not be making final decisions for the group. And so I think he may have overstepped his bounds on this in this particular meeting with Mrs. Bowman. All right, number 4. I think the school needs to create a set of expectations of what is expected of parent volunteers at school events. It says Mr. Stevens relies on parent volunteers to attend and assume responsibility for duties at athletic events. If those expectations are not clearly laid out, then that could definitely lead to some issues. Something that they might want to look at is before a parent can assist, they would either need to attend some type of training to make these expectations clear, or possibly sign a statement saying that they have read the expectations and completely understand them. We don't want to make it hard for parents to volunteer, but they certainly need to know what's expected of them. They certainly need to know of things that have happened in the past that we are trying to avoid. So debriefing the problem or unresolved issues. So some of my thoughts on this problem. I was surprised that Mr. Stevens was the only administrator in the building. It seems like a fairly large enough building that he would probably require some help. I have actually been involved in something like this, but sometimes when unfortunate events such as this take place, it's very common to want to create a new policy. And I've even suggested 2 or 3 new policies as my solution to this problem. I don't know that that is always the best way. I know in my previous experience as an athletic director, we had an issue come up. We immediately created a new policy related to it, and I don't know that that always solves the problem. So I think they either need to follow their current policies more closely or, yes, possibly create a new procedure. Considering the fact that Mrs. Bowman had just recently met with Mr. Stevens requesting money and was denied that request, I think she handled this situation quite carelessly. I think she should have been much more aware of how it might have looked if she had just requested money and was not given that money, and then all of a sudden she's involved in something kind of suspicious like this. I think she should have notified Mr. Stevens a little sooner when the torn ticket situation arose. So I think she should have handled this situation a little bit better. I also think that Mr. Stevens needs to be more visible and diligent during these events. He should probably check in a little more periodically with his parent volunteers and assist them with the accounting of ticket sales. I think unless you get law enforcement involved and do a major internal investigation, it's going to be very difficult to determine who actually took the funds, unfortunately. I'd like to know where the $50 bill what ended up that was used by Mr. Dumas. I'd like to know who assisted Mrs. Bowman in the ticket sales. I'd like to know how the Bowmans plan to fund this trip to New York that their daughter Lucy is going on. And I'd like to know why Mr. Stevens didn't notify the PTA of Mrs. Bowman's request. Again, he should be just an advisor on that, and he should let the PTA know. Okay, so how does the principal promote the effective and efficient management of the school? I think there's 3 pieces of evidence in this case study that point to how he's doing that. Number 1, he followed the accounting procedures and precautions at the conclusion of the event in regards to the money. So he accounted for the funds that night, and he was also escorted by security when depositing the funds. Once again, I mentioned this before, he needs to be more visible during the event, and he'll need to review policy policies and procedures related to his work at events and also the expectations of volunteers. Number 2, he works with the Booster Club to make sure that they have enough parent volunteers at these events. The Booster Club asks that they have 4 volunteers help with each event, and Mr. Stevens has ensured that they do have those volunteers. Excuse me. And then finally, by performing his supervisory duties at the basketball game. This is a big part of being an administrator, being at events, providing supervision. But once again, I think he needs some assistance in this matter, especially if the basketball games are at capacity. I mean, if we're talking about large crowds and he's the only supervisor, I think that's going to be an issue. That would help him be able to check in more regularly with parent volunteers as well. Component 2, how does the principal promote the social learning of every student? Number 1, by promoting the use of volunteers. I think it's very important to become involved in your community as a volunteer, and it's good that students are able to see the parents involved in their school. You could possibly promote this by offering some type of an award to volunteers, maybe a volunteer of the month. Number 2, by offering extracurricular activities at the school. They currently offer basketball, volleyball, track, and cheer. Extracurricular activities are great opportunities for student growth, and I wonder if there maybe are other activities that could be offered, maybe an academic extracurricular such as Scholars Bowl. And social learning, how is it promoted? Number 3, by promoting positive community relations. As stated in the case study, Mr. Stevens visits with patrons during these events and seems to have a good relationship with them. It said he's well liked by the parents, PTA, and the Booster Club. When these community relations will help community members feel welcome at the school. Because of that, they may want to become involved in the school, and it's important for students to see these people from the community involved in the school. Helps them to understand that the school is important and that they care about the school and the students. And then component 3, how does the principal promote student academic learning? Number 1, he is ensuring that the PTA is using their funds to help a majority of the students, not just certain individuals. He did this when he was denied the funding request for Lucy Bowman's cheer trip. Again, he may not have actually had the authority to do that, but he was looking out for the majority of his students. And I think he should encourage Mrs. Bowman to approach the PTA with her funding request. Number 2, the school offers something called the Reading Buddies program. Again, this is another way of promoting academic learning. There are parent volunteers that assist with this program. And number 3, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but nowhere is it mentioned in the case study that teachers from the school were involved in helping at the athletic events. Instead, there are parent volunteers. I suppose it could be argued that this will allow staff members to stay fresh rather than being out late at a school event. However, I believe it's important for students to see their teachers at their events, to know that teachers care about them. However, I don't think you can actually force teachers to perform this extracurricular work anyway. My sources, I used our textbook, Money Matters, a Handbook for Principals, and of course the case study, and that information came from 2 sources. Thank you very much.